dear friends, having given you a small glimpse of the papacy and the Catholic notion of tradition and the magisterium, I think we're sufficiently disposed now to look at the question of the crisis in the church and the response of the Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. Tomorrow we'll look at the question of our duty to resist the novel reforms that have taken place within the church. But today we want to look at more closely what do we mean by the crisis and what are the main causes, if you want, for the crisis in the church. While I'll take somewhat of a different approach in that regard to what you might be used to, it's only as a means of broadening your outlook on the present crisis. So as you know, since the Second Vatican Council, we have seen several reforms introduced into the church which have done some tremendous harm to the mystical body. It is almost today as though the church was suffering from some sort of autoimmune disease as a result of these disastrous reforms. Many of the novel ideas which were approved of during the Second Vatican Council go back to previous ideas of the secular world, which would find their way to the heart of the church, if not directly, at least indirectly, through the various ambiguous texts of the council itself. Here I'm referring to primarily ideas which were promoted during the Masonic French Revolution, such as equality, liberty, and fraternity, which are secular humanist ideas and have always been promoted by the enemies of the church. At the Second Vatican Council, there would be an embrace of these ideas in the text of religious liberty that gave the impression that all religions have equal rights of expression, in the text of collegiality that tries to reduce the church to a democratic organization and places the Pope somewhat on equal footing with the bishops, and the text on ecumenism that sought to imply that all religions are equally valid in their expression of the divine. The council then sought to, we can say, baptize and embrace such revolutionary concepts, which after the council would work to undermine the very heart and the mission of the church herself. And we today are now living to see the disastrous consequence of these ideas as they've played out. Archbishop Lefebvre at the time and a number of other well-informed bishops opposed these ideas because they could see that if they were taken to their logical progression, they would do immense harm to the church. And that's what we've seen today. Keeping in mind that all revolutions always require a removal of the old order in order to make way for the new. And that's what we saw, a removal of the past traditions, the customs, and the ideology of the church in order to make way for a new revolutionary ideology. The problem with this new order is that it attacks the faith and the customs of the church, and it introduces ideas and a spirit that goes against the ancient faith. Vatican II, we can say, gave a rubber stamp to the revolutionary ideas that were long held by the enemies of the church in previous centuries. Some of these ideas, we can say, if we want to give a clear expression to them in practice, are these. Firstly, we see the public promotion of modernist and false philosophies, which are both anti-scholastic and really anti-intellectual, being taught in Catholic universities and seminaries. We see secular humanists and secular humanism being promoted in place of the supernatural solution that our Lord and the Church had previously given us. We see the promotion of naturalism, that is, the exaltation of man and human values, which work only to undermine the supernatural value of redemption and the grace given to us by our Lord. And remember, the key doctrine of the Freemasons is precisely the promotion of naturalism, and that's what we see being promoted by the church today. This humanistic, naturalistic outlook to the world and to the problems of the world. And we see then also the promotion of the evolutionary modernist ideas being promoted in order to reject the Catholic notion of tradition, of revelation, of the magisterium of 20 centuries. No longer in their mind is there any unchanging truth, nor any dogma that is to be held as for all time. Everything for the modernists is subject to change according to the time and the feeling of the people. And that's what we are seeing promoted today. We see the practical promotion and exaltation of socialist and communist ideas under the guise of liberation theology, thus misleading the poor with a utopia rather than a real solution to their economic and political problems, which the church in the past has given some great expression and clear ideas in regards to. Instead, we see being put forth the exaltation of socialist and communist ideas, which have really undermined the social and economic fabric of various nations. These ideas have begun to permeate within the church, so much so that even Bishop Athanasius Schneider not so long ago said, if the church no more or sufficiently enough influences the world and its realities with supernatural gifts, grace, light of divine truth, and instead deals predominantly with affairs of natural and temporal realities, that is the social justice and ecology and so on, then the church closes herself in the temporal and deprives the world of eternal, of heaven. And he goes on to add, the fact that the predominant activity of many of the official structures of the Catholic Church today, associations, commissions, and so on, is isolated from the supernatural, from heaven, and is immersed in the temporal and in the horizontal, represents the core problem of the current crisis in the Church. And this is, again, Cardinal Athanasius Schneider confirming the points that I previously made. And this has resulted in the disastrous effects which we are seeing within the world today. The Archbishop Lefebvre, on the outset of these disastrous reforms, wrote to Paul VI saying, "Let your holiness abandon that ill-omened undertaking of compromise with the ideas of modern man, an undertaking which originates in the secret understanding between high dignitaries in the church and those of Masonic lodges since before the council." There has always been a battle between the church and her enemies. Now the church has embraced the ideology of the enemies of the church. God, in his goodness, raised up Archbishop Lefebvre, so to speak out against these secular humanist ideas. He was not afraid to combat these errors because he was armed with the wisdom of the popes and the theologians who had addressed these issues long ago. The Archbishop, in his great work, I would say perhaps the best work he ever composed, only second to the They Have Uncrowned Him, his work against the heresies. Here, the Archbishop simply pulls out the great wisdom of the popes and the theologians of the past, and clearly shows these false ideas for what they are, and that they have been refuted and condemned in clear terms long ago by the ancient wisdom of the popes. This filled him with confidence, for it is this that was the foundation of his rejection of the present ideas, not himself or his own opinion, but on the sure and guiding light of the magisterium of all ages. While the Archbishop would initially receive approval from the church for his seminary and his work of forming priests, it isn't hard to understand why not long after that he was, we might say, condemned by those in the hierarchy for his work, which was later suppressed, because no doubt it stood in diametric opposition to what they stood for. And so he was not going to, for long, go unnoticed. But nevertheless, the Archbishop was not deterred by the unjust suppression, but would continue his work with confidence. And as he says in his declaration of 1974, "We pursue our work of the formation of priests under the star of the aged-old magisterium, in conviction that we can thus do no greater service to the Holy Catholic Church, to the Sovereign Pontiff, and to future generations." In other words, I do my work with the Church, for the Church, and in submission to what the Church has always stood for. And it is out of love for the church, out of love for the sovereign pontiff, and out of love for the zeal for the salvation of souls and those who would benefit from our work to come. Writing in those early times in the crisis, Monsignor Ralph Gamba, in his work titled Athanasius and the Church of Our Time, points out that what happened over 1600 years ago, talking about during the Arian crisis, is repeating itself today, he says, but with 2 or 3 differences. Alexandria, where the Arian crisis broke out, is the whole universal church, the stability of which is being shaken, and what is undertaken at the time by means of physical force and cruelty is now being transferred to a different level. Exile is replaced by banishment into silence, of being ignored, killed by assassination of character. And that's what we are seeing today within the church. Those who are, we could say, stating the obvious, those who are telling the emperor he's got no clothes on, well, they're being cast out. And here when we speak about telling the emperor he has no clothes on, we're referring to the pointing out to the hierarchy that there is a clear absence of faith amongst their teachings and their actions. Commenting on this episode in church history during the 4th century, during the Arian crisis, Father William Jungens points out that at one point in the church's history, only a few years before Gregory Nazianzen presented his preaching, perhaps the number of Catholic bishops in possession of sees, as opposed to Arian bishops in possession of their sees or the diocese, was no greater than something between 1 and 3% of the total. Had doctrine been determined by popularity, today we would all be deniers of Christ and the opponents of the Spirit. In the time of Emperor Valens, during the 4th century, Saint Basil was virtually the only solid Catholic bishop in all of the East who succeeded in retaining charge of his see. If it had no other importance for modern man, knowledge of a history of the Arianism should demonstrate at least the Catholic Church takes no account of popularity and numbers in shaping and maintaining doctrine. Else, we should long since have had to abandon St. Basil and St. Hilary and St. Athanasius and so on, and call ourselves after Arians. In other words, the church doctrine isn't determined by number or popularity. It's determined by those who cling to the ancient faith, and we already saw that. Michael Davies, commenting on this point during the Arian crisis, says that during a time of apostasy, those who remain true to the faith may have to worship outside the official churches in order not to compromise that faith. They may have to look for truly Catholic teaching not from the bishops of their country, not even from the Roman pontiff, but to one heroic confessor who other bishops and even the Roman pontiff may have repudiated or excommunicated. Such is the situation today. We see clearly a battle between those in the hierarchy who have embraced the revolutionary ideas and those who oppose them. I want to quote a point that Cardinal Newman makes about this episode during the 4th century, which is quite, I think, relevant to us today to understand how we are to see or look upon, in my personal opinion, the present hierarchy of the church today. So Cardinal Newman, in his work on consulting the faithful in matters of doctrine, states, referring to this episode in church history in Arian heresy, states that, on the other hand, then, I say that there was, during the Arian crisis, a temporary suspension in the ecclesia docens, in the teaching church. The body of bishops failed in their confession of the faith. They spoke variously, one against another. There was nothing after Nicaea of firm, unvarying, consistent testimony for nearly 60 years. There were untrustworthy councils, unfaithful bishops. There was weakness, fear of consequences, misguidance, delusion, hallucination, endless hopelessness, extending itself into nearly every corner of the Catholic Church. The comparatively few who remained faithful were discredited and driven into exile. The rest were either deceivers or deceived. And as you know, the faithful during that time the famous Bishop Saint Athanasius. He was exiled from his see, and it was he who coined the term, "They have the churches, but we have the faith." And today we can say with Cardinal Newman, perhaps, that namely that there is in practice a suspension of the actual bindingness of the teaching authority of the hierarchy due to the erroneous and contradictory message that is being put forth by them, and has consistently been put forth by them since the Second Vatican Council. And so until the magisterium once more resonates with one voice, with one chorus, with the voice of the past, in clarity of her doctrine and her doctrinal expression, until then we maintain our reservation of anything that comes forth from the hierarchy that is today. We have a hierarchy today that is deeply filled with the spirit of secular humanism and imbued profoundly with the poison of the heresy of modernism. Archbishop Lefebvre, in his reaction to the hierarchy, always maintained an unwavering faith in the traditional doctrine, but nevertheless always had a respectful attitude to those who occupied the seats of authority in the church. And in this, he is certainly a great model for us. Today, let me just conclude by turning our sentiments perhaps to Saint Athanasius once more, and asking him to grant us, like he did during the 4th century, despite being opposed. The old saying was of Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world. Despite the vast opposition, he was generous in his zeal and enduring in his patience, and faithful in seeking to trust in God during that storm. So let us turn to Saint Athanasius to grant us, like him, a generous zeal, a lively faith, and patience in the storm, so that we may faithfully one day come to the harbour of salvation. Amen.